Okay, welcome everyone to OCI's Credentialing Readiness webinar series. And today we have with us Alex Colgan. I'll introduce Alex in a second. Before we get into our discussion, I just want to remind everyone of our antitrust policy and that we don't talk about pricing, sales terms, territories, refusal to deal, anything of that nature. If you feel like we get into those areas, please let me know and we'll table that conversation until we speak to counsel. So today we're going to talk a little bit about some DSCSA resources, the challenge that we have with authentication and authorization within the DSCSA Enhanced Drug Distribution Security System. And then Alex is going to give us perspective from a LedgerDomain's perspective on DSCSA challenges, VRS, ATP, and a few other areas. And we only have a couple of folks on the call, so maybe we can take questions as we go. Is that okay, Alex?
Sounds good.
Okay. So today's speaker, speaking of Alex, so Alex is obviously very involved in a lot of the different areas around DSCSA. He's involved with PDG, HDA, the VRS working group, the GS1 Secure Supply Chain working group, and he also serves as the OCI steering and policy and architecture committees. Before joining LedgerDomain, Alex held marketing and developer programs at Leap Motion, and he has a master's degree in social and political thought from University of Regina. So let's be careful about that. Alex, I'll let you talk a little bit about the LedgerDomain, and then I'll set up the challenges that we're having here.
Yeah, absolutely. So LedgerDomain, we originally had our roots in authenticating and tracking and coordinating data within the clinical supply chain. This was, as early as 2017, 18. We ended up breaking over into the DSCSA space to take some of the, newer, more lightweight tooling that we had developed to, help sponsors and CROs and clinical sites coordinate on their, clinical inventory, because we were really excited about the rollout of the serialization level requirements and what that sort of represented on the commercial side of the house. So we participated in the FDA's DSCSA pilot project program back in 2019, sort of exploring alternative approaches to things like trading partner authentication, verification, tracking, trace. And then from there, sort of ended up folding our efforts over into the OCI credentialing ecosystem, picking up on, some of these additional applications that had sort of emerged over the years, traceability, exceptions, and really our main focus since, I would say, 2020 has really been around, using a verifiable credential as the kernel to understand, who a party is and, whether or not they're entitled to, undertake certain activities, and kind of build out on top of that a series of applications that, really leverages that, initial point of interaction. So obviously our first area had a lot more to do with, interactions between indirect business partners or indirect trading partners. And more we're focusing in on, what we can do even when direct trading partners need to interact with each other outside of, very well-established systems.
Thanks, Alex.
Next slide.
Yeah. So let's just talk a little bit about resources and what the challenge is. So there are a number of resources. As you saw, all of the entities that Alex is involved in also has resources. If you look at the PDG website, you'll see their DSCSA blueprint, and that provides standardized information around TITS exchange, PI verification, tracing, and credentialing. And so those are good resources to start with. GS1 obviously underpins a lot of what we do within DSCSA, from barcoding all the way through verification standard and EPCIS. HDA has been working and has companies have been using their VRS architecture for verifying product information. And within OCI, we've developed the open credential specifications that are pointed to from the PDG. And there's some interesting work there that you can look at. So let's just talk a little bit about what the issue is or what the challenge is around authentication and authorization within DSCSA. And I'm going to preface this a bit, and I don't have a slide for this, but I've been working with the pharmaceutical industry now for 20-something years on this. And we started out with the pedigree messaging, the pedigree standard back in 2005. And that was to support state legislation on pedigrees. We lovingly called that, when I was with GS1, the snowball, because you added information to it as the product moved through the supply chain. The industry decided that they wanted a more decentralized solution or architecture as we moved into DSCSA, and that's what we'll see here. So if we think about typical trading partner relationships, before you either have a supplier or a customer, you go through a certain amount of authentication and authorization, or know your customer, know your supplier, and then you start to actually provide information to each other through orders, shipments, invoices, payments, things like that. So that's pretty typical. You know who you're dealing with, you know how you're providing them with information, and how they're providing you with information. As we get into DSCSA, there is a number of interactions that are specified under DSCSA, most notably product information verification and tracing, which occur in a very decentralized manner. So even though you may have authentication or authorization worked out between yourself and your immediate trading partners, you may receive, if you're a manufacturer or a repackager, you may receive product information verification from entities that you don't specifically do business with, but are part of the legitimate supply chain. And also with anyone in the supply chain, from a trace point of view, you may receive a trace request from anyone in the supply chain or a regulator or DSCSA authority, and need to be able to react to that. So in the case of TI-TS exchange, that follows our traditional way of doing things. You have authentication and authorization that happens between adjacent trading partners. You work that out. You provide TI-TS information to those that you sell product to. But when we're talking about product information verification and tracing information, this is where, from an automated point of view, from a digital credential point of view, this is how we use credentials for authentication and authorization. Again, you may not have an immediate relationship with the entity that's asking you or providing you information, but you should know who you're getting information from and who you're providing information to. So that's sort of the challenge we have and why credentials exist in this environment, because we are operating in a very decentralized environment for these two transactions. And the solution that we've developed and the specifications we developed in OCI are around providing those credentials that can be verified. So Alex, I'll turn this over to you to talk a little bit about your thoughts on the challenges and where we are at.
Awesome, thanks, Bob. Next slide. So, you know, I think Bob covered this really well, and I'll just sort of touch in on a few of the same themes before I dig into some of the details. VRS, of course, the initial motivating use case for credentials, and what we've seen over the last 18 months has been really a focus on an expansion to, you know, trace, direct trading partner confirmation, exceptions, really any of these workflows where knowing that the sender was an authorized trading partner and being able to authenticate the corporate or ownership information of the sender is important. And I think if we go to the next slide, we'll sort of see where all of these things are currently. So, this I have to credit Bob for this asset, even though it's in my part of the deck. In any sort of technological rollout, you'll tend to see this innovation curve, moving from early innovations all the way over to sort of more, something becoming a traditional or well-established system. TI/TS exchange, of course, is fairly mainstream at this point. It's been baked into FDA guidances. The dispenser adoption of VRS, or the VRS more broadly, is also pretty firmly within the mainstream space. But further down along the line, what we're seeing is the advancement and evolution of additional use cases, trace, exceptions management, different forms of validation. If we go to the next slide, again, I'll focus first on that initial motivating use case for VRS. So with VRS, we have 20 odd solution providers set up a network, need to be able to meet verification for a number of different use cases. We need to be able to send messages back and forth between solution providers. We need to be able to get responses quickly. The challenge that folks ran into relatively early on was that the manufacturers regard this as being compliance data, and compliance data to a certain extent has to accord with certain GMP principles, certain data integrity principles, access principles, CFR Chapter 11, Part 21. And in all of these cases, what we found, particularly with certain manufacturers who were a little bit further ahead than others in terms of thinking around these issues, was, hey, I have an SLA with my own VRS provider. They make certain guarantees to me as part of the contract that I have with them. The problem is that I don't have the same SLA with all the others. So what do? Do I have to audit, do I have to audit the systems and processes of all the other VRS providers? How am I going to face up with this? Do the VRS providers have to audit each other? Do they have to, all purchase the, massive cyber liability insurance policies specifically around this? Do they have to, come to a common core understanding of the threshold that's required for a trading partner to be able to make a request on the network? Or, is there another way around this problem? Next slide. So, this is where we are today with, VRS and credentials. There is, an independent credential issuer that can, validate and monitor the authorized trading partner status of somebody who's participating on the network. The access to that wallet is delegated to the VRS provider, who's able to sort of stamp those onto requests as they go back and forth. So rather than requiring on an attestation of a GLN or an attestation of an email address, which anybody can staple onto any message, you have signatures that really amount to a higher standard in terms of being able to gauge who's making a request and then being able to respond with confidence. Next slide. So our team kind of focused in on some of the additional workflows that you could build out on top of this capability. Because at the end of the day, what we're talking about is being able to append a verifiable presentation of a credential to any message and use that to verify the source of the message, regardless of the channel that it's being carried over. And obviously the devil is in the details with some of these things. You have to maybe layer in a couple of extra bits when it comes to sending something through an email, as opposed to a network like the VRS, where it relies on mutual X509 certificate handshakes. But at the end of the day, we're talking about, I want to be able to instantly prove my ATP status. I want to know that somebody else is an ATP. What can I do with that? So we ended up building out, a set of different workflows kind of stacked out on top of this. And throughout this entire process, we've focused in on this as a standards-driven approach. Um, there's a lot to be said for the use of verifiable credentials within one's own organization. Because you can, even within one's own four walls, you ideally want to move as close to a zero trust environment as you can. The US federal government has signaled this, and it's, anything new that you build out today should be built out along these sorts of principles. But, obviously at the same time, it's a lot less interesting to us if we're only talking to ourselves versus if we're able to talk with, other people. So, whether we're talking about Trace, which was developed collaboratively at PDG with, Bob really, driving the bus on getting everybody aligned on what the messaging standard needed to look like, or exceptions, which we made a donation to PDG earlier this year, and that is now being run through its own working group. In all of these cases, we want to move in towards an open standards driven approach as much as possible, while at the same time focusing in on, easing that on-ramp, and facilitating folks who may have a credential, may not have a credential. If they have a credential, then they're clear. If they don't have a credential, how can we support our customers in terms of, interoperating with them and kind of nudging them more and more towards getting credentialed in order to unlock the sort of full extent of these workflows. And I think it's probably useful as we go to the next slide to think about what it is that a credential does. So if I get a verifiable presentation of a credential from somebody over, over a secure channel, then, I know that it's really Bob. Bob really does represent this pharmacy. The pharmacy has a valid license. The license is valid as of the last time the state database was checked. I can log that as an event. But the really crazy thing that we realized about the verifiable credential standard early on is that once it's authenticated, a credential can be monitored for as long as it exists. And I want to lean in on that really hard. A verifiable presentation of a credential only lasts for a very short amount of time. In the case of the ones that we send over the VRS, it lasts for 5 minutes. But once you get one of these things once, you can actually go back and check that credential as often and as frequently as you want. So if I'm a trading partner and I have a credential and I have 30 trading partners and each of them has a credential, I only have to get a verifiable presentation from each of them once, and then I can check those credentials anytime I want. So if we go to the next slide.
Oh, sorry.
No worries.
Getting there.
So this is sort of how we're seeing, how all of these components are stacking up today. And, to be fair, there's probably a midpoint within here around, certain, licensure check capabilities. But if you're kind of looking at the polar opposites in terms of what an all electronic confirmation workflow looks like. Now, remember, FDA last year, as part of the cutover on November 27th, they announced a stabilization period for certain requirements in the law. However, the authorized trading partner requirement has been in place since 2015. It's never gone away. And one of the things that FDA called out quite a bit at the point of that transition period was that there was an expectation that the EDDS as a whole needs to operate in an electronic interoperable mode. And if we think about, what the polar opposites are in terms of electronic and interoperable, well, credentials are electronic and interoperable, but not a lot of people have them. Email is electronic and interoperable, and everybody has them. So we, think about, what the burden is for a trading partner that has to, rely on, say, an electronic trail on the of emails on the one hand versus a trading partner that's able to make use of a credential. The email process is very involved. It is essentially a manual process baked into a back and forth. Still meets the 6-year auditability requirement with annual checks, as long as you've logged it into your QMS, or you're confident in your email system. A lot of manual checks that have to happen. You have to sort of bake it all in so that if you are subject to an inspection later, you can pull up that whole thread and run through it. But email is a little bit of a rat's nest. Credentials, on the other hand, a trading partner might share out a credential, share additional information on the back of that credential, such as their preferred GLNs or some other information. And then their authorized trading partner status can be monitored pretty much indefinitely, as long as the credential exists. So if we go to the next slide, I want to show you how we've been tackling this at LedgerDomain at a high level, which is an address book. So if I am a trading partner and I want to know that all of my trading partners are authorized trading partners, I can stand up this address book application. So first I've got my own credential. I can plug that credential in for VRS. I can plug it into Trace. I think the really important thing that we have to remember as we are, talking about credentials and thinking about how credentials work is that, nobody really wants a credential in the abstract. A credential that's sort of floating out in space isn't really useful to anybody. You want a credential because it lets you do certain things. A credential is a key, or something that facilitates a certain type of activity. Nobody wants a credential for a credential's sake. They want a credential because they want a verification response, or they want to secure how they respond to requests, or they want to make a trace request and know that it's going to be not involve a lot of back and forth about who they are and why they're asking. And one of the ways that you can use a credential is also to demonstrate your own ATP status and send a signal to your trading partners that they ought to do the same. I have an obligation under the law to show that I'm an authorized trading partner. You have an obligation to show me. If we don't show that to each other, then we're not meeting our own requirements, and we don't want to get a 483. So if we go to the next tab, the way that the address book application works is that you can manage your own credential. You can send presentations of your own credential to anybody that you want. You can, on the next slide, track your trading partners. You have a list of who your trading partners are, the points of contact from an authorized trading partner sort of ownership standpoint at each of your trading partners. On the next tab, you can add a new trading partner, plug in their contact information, send an email with your own credential and the credential request. On the next tab, you'll see what this ends up looking like. So they get an email, I'm requesting your authorized trading partner information. I'm a manufacturer. Here's attached as a presentation of my own credential if you want to check it or log it in your own system. From there, they can, on the next tab, submit a response to the button that you saw in the email. If they have their own credential, they can plug in a verifiable presentation of the credential. If they don't, that's okay. They can fill out the form with as much information as they want. So if they have a verifiable presentation of a credential, our system logs that, and they are verified in the address book as long as that credential is valid. If the credential gets revoked, or there's another issue with it, then that authentication is lost. The user gets an alert, and then they can follow up with that trading partner in order to get that patched. But let's say that the counterparty doesn't have a credential, and again, not everybody will. In that case, what we can do on the next tab is at least within the course of the stabilization period, over the the next several months, you just do a manual authentication. I know this trading partner. I know this individual at this trading partner. I went and checked on the state licensure database this morning, and I saw that they had a license and that it was valid. And then that's a manual authentication. So from there, if you go to the next slide, you see that, you can see and track the ATP status over time. If they're authenticated by a credential, if they're authenticated by, a manual authentication. And obviously the sort of midpoint here is that, there are really incredible services out there like LedgerDomain's License Verify that, lets you kind of patch out and, undertake license monitoring over a period of time. And the identity and corporate proofing stage is kind of a separate stage in that know your customer, know your supplier process. In those cases, what they can do in the address book is, have the manual justification, the manual check, and then, plug it in out to a service like License Verify and be able to monitor the status of that license, where the identity proofing was done as part of an internal SOP rather than as a credential. And that's really it. So with this address book application, we've really been able to just kind of close up this authorized trading partner validation question in a relatively simple, lightweight format. Provide some ongoing monitoring on the back of the credentials. Get credential holders a new tool to sort of nudge their trading partners towards, it would make my life a lot easier if you had a credential. Otherwise, I might have to follow up with you periodically. It's just another one of these use cases, in addition to the other components that we've been able to build out on the stack. I think as we move on to the discussion portion, maybe Bob, if you want to go back to slide 20, credential powered workflows, that might be a good, that's the one with the 3 boxes and the little robot on the top. That's probably a good one for us to land on. Yeah. Also, I don't know if anybody else is seeing this, but the view is looking very desaturated.
Oh, is it?
Yeah. Does anybody else see that?
Yes, it's the same.
Yeah, it's kind of washed out.
Wonder why.
Just everybody trust me. It looks nicer than that.
So Alex, are we at the QA?
We are. Let's do it.
Okay, so I think what's just a comment. I think what's interesting here that you showed is, traditionally we looked at credentials as being part of a decentralized system, and they flow along with those messages, PI verification or tracing that need them. And what you showed here was an interesting way of preempting some of that by working with your known trading partners, or even those that you are going to bump into from time to time. If somebody is doing a lot of verifications and they're not a immediate trading partner, but you see this occurring over time, then your system can reach out to them and work out the credentials and work out the authentication authorization in advance of needing them. And that's kind of interesting. I think what's also interesting is that you tied it to the fact that once you have a credential, the software, so the issuer and the wallets are committed that they check those credentials on a periodic basis.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can rely on that, the fact that they are always fresh, and you can essentially look through your customer list or interesting parties in the supply chain list and know that they're still have a legitimate credential. So I think that was an interesting way of you thinking a little bit outside the DSCSA box, if you will. Does anybody have any? I know there was a question about drop shipments. And maybe I'll just frame that a bit. In the case of a drop shipment, PDG has outlined 3 different ways that TI information gets between those trading partners. So we've got a dispenser that's ordered a product from a wholesaler. Wholesaler doesn't have it, so they've asked the manufacturer to drop ship it directly to the dispenser. So there are 3 different ways that have been recognized. Some wholesalers are willing to pass through the TITS information, so the manufacturer can send it to the wholesaler will get it to the dispensers. The second way of doing that is some manufacturers are putting in their shipping documents the address and the way that the dispenser can get to that information in the manufacturer's portal. So the dispenser would go into the portal and see that information. And the third way is for those manufacturers and dispensers that already have a relationship. It may be a large dispenser and they order direct some products from the manufacturer. So they have a direct relationship. They have most likely an EPCIS connection, and so they could pass information that way. From a PI verification point of view, I don't know that that makes any difference. The process works the same. From a tracing point of view, the fact that they may, in that third scenario, that they may already have a relationship kind of touches on what you've shown here, that it may be that they've already exchanged credentials and they both know that they're talking to each other in a trace situation too. Now, John, if that answers your question, or
yeah, it does. And I think what Alex covered there with going through the process, I guess I was just wondering also, once we're through the stabilization period, at times you may have drop shipment process that's, when a trace comes through because the drop shipment was done under allocation, you may not have already set up these credentials, but it seems like with this solution, there's a couple ways to go about doing that in terms of either requesting credentials or working through the manual process and then updating the address book. Is that correct, Alex?
Yeah, that would be true. I think in all of these cases, when we're building out our own applications, is the credential is always the way to speed to the finish line and get there without any undue busy work. But then we sort of layer in the undue busy work as necessary when our customers are nudging for it. Because nobody wants to have to do that manual work, but there's also just a recognition that somebody wants to get a response instantly or near instantly and not have to provide a lot of information up front. They can get a credential. Otherwise we sort of lay out the path, and the path may be bumpy, but it is there.
Yeah, and I guess everybody might have a different sensitivity as to when they decide that the manual path isn't working for them and it's becoming more of an issue for them. Yeah,
and it does depend at that point on an individual manufacturer's SOPs. And that's one of the reasons why I think the credentials have been sort of gaining more traction recently, is that as manufacturers have been kind of looking a little, you can either spin up your own SOP from scratch and then have to really drill down into sort of operationalizing it, and then having the workforce required to actually be able to run through all of those pieces and then have to log it for 6 years, which is a little bit of a high wire act with everything else that's going on. PDG, of course, is not binding as a as a framework, but it has, I think, most folks would generally agree, has emerged as a set of best practices. And the fact that it's an FDA public-private partnership has also meant to a certain extent that it becomes a little bit of a safe harbor. So, if we're following the PDG blueprint, then, at a certain point, what we've heard from, many regulatory affairs experts and quality folks at the manufacturer level, that it's not exactly a safe harbor in the same way that, you see similar frameworks in the banking or financial space, but it's sort of a de facto safe harbor, which is if your systems and processes are aligned with the blueprint and lean into it, you can't really be faulted because it's something that has emerged under both industry consensus, but also under FDA observation.
Hmm.
The
You would
challenge is
hope
when
not, but it's happened in other areas, so I would be very cautious with that.
yeah, I think that's also fair. Again, I walk up to a line which is it's not actually a safe harbor. But if you look at, say, the 483 warning letter that went out to SafeChain last year, there's actually a fair amount that's instructive in there.
Now, does anybody know where credentialing stands with the pharmacies at this point? Are they starting to take over their own credentialing, or are they actually starting to go for credentials more frequently? Because especially I'm a little concerned with the smaller pharmacies that maybe might be in the 1 to 4 location range where they may not even know what's about to happen to them, and it's going to throw the industry into that manual process that you mentioned, where that's going to be a challenge with the amount of volume you're talking about here. If there becomes an issue with having to do some tracing because of an incident.
Well, the your timing is interesting. Did folks see the announcement from FDA this morning?
Yeah, yeah.
I did not. I haven't. I've been on other things, but
So FDA has gone ahead and granted an exemption to small dispensers.
I think it's enforcement discretion. Is an exemption? Does the word
They
exemption?
say exemption.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
Specifically, yeah. And I'll highlight one thing to you, by the way, and this is a really critical piece. The law says that a small dispenser is defined as an organization that has 25 or fewer full-time employees. The exemption says that a dispenser is considered a small dispenser for the purposes of the exemptions if, as of November 27th of this year, the company that owns the dispenser has 25 or fewer full-time employees licensed as pharmacists or qualified as pharmacy technicians.
Mm. Yeah.
So if you have a grocery store with a pharmacy in it, it's a small dispenser, even if it has, 50 full-time employees, because it only counts if they're pharmacists or pharmacy techs. So FDA, for the purposes of that exemption, has actually expanded on the definition a little bit. But John, I want to come back to your earlier question. Again, credentialing is one of those things that's really only used in the event of a certain type of activity, right? Nobody gets a credential in the abstract. They get a credential if they need to do something, and a credential is the thing that allows them to do that thing. In terms of the larger organizations at the bottom of the supply chain, what we've been seeing is that there is growing and abiding interest in the use of the VRS for a number of different reasons. We're also at the point now where 10% of the manufacturers' GTINs on the VRS are associated with manufacturers who have bought, provisioned, and pushed into production credentials and are planning on pushing those credentials from optional to mandatory through the course of the stabilization period, in some cases later this summer. So what that means is that at a certain point, you've got users at the bottom employing the VRS who are going to run into error 301s when they submit requests up through the VRS. And the reason they're going to get those error 301s is that their requests lack a credential. And there are a number of different reasons why you, as a small dispenser, would want to use the VRS. And I don't think we're going to have time to get into all those reasons today, but I would certainly point towards I think, some wrinkles around how saleable returns and how saleable returns verification is set to operate, and the use of VRS for other types of activities. It's been expanded outside of saleable returns, and that is also sort of progressively ramping up during the course of the summer. So at a certain point, if you want to verify a drug package to support one of these activities and you keep getting these errors back, then the credential is what you need in order to not have to sort of go off of the VRS and run it through a manual process. It's a little bit like if you had a phone and it turned out that you weren't able to call 10% of the phone numbers that exist. At a certain point, you would just purchase the add-on that allowed you to unlock that 10% of numbers. So it's a little bit of a snowballing piece. The larger organizations at the bottom of the supply chain, the really big dispenser chains, have sent some pretty strong signals that they're going to staple this on as part of their own implementations. The medium to smaller, I think, are obviously a bit further behind. Their own solution providers are layering in VRS as a component of some of how they're going to be handling some of their own DSCSA requirements. So that it ends up kind of slipping in under at that point. In terms of direct trading partner authentication, will a small dispenser purchase a credential in order to demonstrate that they are an authorized trading partner to the supplier? It's not especially likely. At the level of the small pharmacy, they do tend to lean very heavily on a lot of manual methods, and are, we don't because of antitrust, we don't discuss pricing on these calls, but they're very price averse, and that's understandable. And I think as the EDDS continues to evolve and as we sort of push along on this innovation curve, the small pharmacies will probably be the last to end up getting credentialed, particularly with this additional window that the FDA has granted them. And that's just a natural part of how these systems and processes rolled out. They're not even able to support EPCIS.
Hmm.
Well, and I'm wondering also if how many of them, the small pharmacies, are supplied by the big three distributors, whether they're going to go into an agreement with the distributors to in their systems to manage some of this stuff. But I don't know where that stands. I'm going to be honest with you. It's been a while since I've talked with anybody about that at all.
So for verification requests, the position that the wholesalers have taken is that they cannot and will not do it
Smart.
on behalf of the dispensers. Yeah, it's getting into their it's starting to muck around in the regulatory obligations of their own customers, and there's zero inclination to do it. There are certainly, we'll make available a portal that you can go in and access the information that we are required to send to you, the transaction information, the transaction statement, the transaction history if we're talking about older transactions. But in terms of like supporting their ability to engage in verification or trace, absolutely not. There's been zero appetite for that, because that's at the end of the day, the letter of the law is that it is up to the dispenser to have a system or a process to be able to undertake that sort of activity. And in most cases, it'll be probably managed offline. It'll be a phone call, or it'll be an email. Or in some cases, a manufacturer might make available a portal that allows for those types of requests to be routed up through, a single process. That's actually one of the components that we provide. And in that case, we've been working with manufacturers who are, wanting to front load a lot of that authentication and get a sense of who people are as they sign into their portals to be able to submit these types of requests. But it's not something that a wholesaler has been inclined to provide to their dispenser customers, unless they actually do have a much closer relationship, like if they're under common ownership and control, for instance, which I think we do end up seeing in the case of some group purchasing organizations.
Interesting.
Mhm.
You know, I think a lot of our conversation now will be, or should have always been, but here we are. How are things pulled up this curve? And so we're starting to see things such as we put on here, dispenser adoption of ERS. So as that starts to occur, then you're going to see authentication, authorization inefficiencies, and people will decide what to do about that, whether they can live with it or whether they need to do something. There's also questions about how many traces will actually occur in the system. So as we start experiencing that, I mean, we really are just at the TITS exchange level still, even though we show that as late. There's a lot of folks who haven't even seen TITS, serialized TITS data yet.
Yeah, I think that's all true. And it'll be interesting to see how these things, wind up shaking out. Even as we get it, of course, even as folks has been spinning up on their, fully serialized data exchange, you never roll out a huge nationwide system like this without running into problems. And that's that, TITS exception processing part of the curve, which is once you start standing all these systems up, then you start to see what types of issues arise. And then it's a matter of ironing those out. And what we found is that in many of these cases, you have to go almost entirely out of band in order to resolve them, undertaking file surgery. Because the way that a lot of these systems are set up, as soon as they accept an EPCIS file, it's extracted, parsed, and the data is kind of spread out to the four winds. And you can't just drop in a fresh one on top of that and expect all of those, downstream systems to still be able to operate. It gets blocked because that's just how these connections have been set up.
Any other questions or comments? Well, Alex, thanks for being with us today and presenting a lot of interesting ways that you're working with the credentials. And like I said, thinking outside of DSCSA box, I think that's pretty cool. Thanks,
Awesome.
everyone.
Thanks all.
Thanks,
Cheers.
Alex.